and welcome. I'm Karina Lesser, the Artistic Director of Scripps Presents, and I'm so glad that so many of you are taking time out of your day to join us for a lecture and conversation about African Americans and the California Dream. Scripps Presents seeks to complement the dynamic humanities curriculum at the college by bringing the most thoughtful and timely writers, artists, and scholars into conversation with our community. Our theme this year, in honor of our 5th anniversary, is the future. For us, it's an opportunity to explore what's next across the disciplines: literature, performance, food, activism, and music. It's also an opportunity to present scholars whose work provides invaluable context to our contemporary world. We're also very pleased to be presenting this program in partnership with Scripps's IDEA Initiative, which focuses on programs and events that advance inclusion, diversity, equity, and access throughout the Scripps community. Which brings us to today's guests. Susan D. Anderson, Scripps class of 75, is the history curator and program manager at the California African American Museum and a member of the editorial board of the journal California History. She has brought her scholarly interest in California's hidden African American history to her writing, lectures, and public history projects as former director of collections, library, exhibitions, and programs at the California Historical Society, interim chief curator for the African American Museum and Library in Oakland, and curator at the UCLA Library's Special Collections. Today, she'll be joined by Stefan Bradley, who is the BCLA Coordinator for Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives and a professor of African American Studies at Loyola Marymount University. A few housekeeping notes. As always, we'd love to hear from you, our audience. So following Susan and Stefan's conversation, they'll be taking questions. Please share yours using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Today's program will begin with a presentation by Susan, and following Stefan will join her for the conversation. And now I'm so pleased to welcome Susan back to the college and to the Scripps Presents virtual stage. Hi, Susan, it's so great to have you.
Thank you, Corinna. I'm going to dive right in and let people know that today I'm going to share some perspectives on research for the book I'm completing for Heyday Books. The working title is African Americans and the California Dream. And the book begins looking at California's African American history in the gold rush starting in 1848. And here you're looking at a picture on the left of Moses Rogers, whose house is on the National Register of Historic Places in Stockton. He was a wealthy mine owner during the gold rush. And on the right, the family of Andrew and Sarah Monroe, whose parents were pioneers in Coloma during the gold rush. And the book travels over 165 years to the creation of the Black Lives Matter hashtag. A lot of people may not be aware that that movement was created in California by Patrisse Cullors of Los Angeles and Alicia Garza of Oakland on a night in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. The focus of the book is on civic history, and it centers African American voices and actors as a way of understanding California. And the way that it centers these voices is by the use of primary source materials. And one example is through this couple whom you're seeing on your screen, Nancy Davis Lester and her husband, Peter Lester, who came to California from Philadelphia in 1850. Peter had been a prominent officer in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And to people back in those times, as well as people today who don't believe that slavery was practiced in California, a free state, his correspondence published in the Pennsylvania Freeman newspaper after he arrived in California in 1850 provides an eyewitness to the phenomenon. He wrote to his comrades in Philadelphia, "I thought when I got here in California, I would have no anti-slavery work to do, but I find as much to do here as I did with you. I find slaveholders are here in California with their slaves from all the slave states in the Union." So the book posits African Americans as protagonists on behalf of freedom in a racialized state. And I feel it's important because the history of the history of the history profession in the United States, by and large, has been one of exclusion and disparagement of African Americans in their role in this country. And we can look at so many thousands of examples, but I'll take one from California. Stanford professor Clyde Dunaway declaring in a 1905 paper about slavery that most colored people were too docile and too ignorant to claim their freedom. And even today, liberal historians like Heather Cox Richardson, just a few days ago, in writing about Reconstruction, made a statement that during Reconstruction, the Republicans gave Black Americans a say in society. And we can talk later about just how problematic a statement that is. So the premise of the book is that California is thought of as a place of openness and liberalness and democracy, but history shows that the state was established in racial inequity and social injustice. So what led to that transformation? And my response is the way to understand California's relative freedoms today is to know the outsized role that African Americans played in transforming the state's civic culture. So one of the ways began also in the 19th century in the resistance to slavery that was practiced in the state. And the resistance came in many forms, as in lawsuits. You're looking at an ad that was taken out in a San Francisco newspaper by the African American Committee that raised the funds on behalf of Archie Lee, who escaped the man who claimed to own him, Charles Stovall, in San Francisco. And the Black community in that city raised funds and used their own wealth to hire lawyers and prosecute the case, which Archie Lee eventually won. And another form of resistance was people working and purchasing their own manumission papers. There's the example of Alvin Coffey, who we're seeing here, who came as an enslaved person to California in 1849 as part of a wagon train. He ended up making the journey between California and Missouri 3 times. He convinced his captors to let him come to California to work in the gold mines, to work as a cobbler, repairing shoes, to work as on farms, to earn the money to buy himself and his family out of bondage. And he and Mahala, his wife, and their children settled in Red Bluff in Tehama County and became very important citizens. And I talk about their story. Also, in Los Angeles, the court case that was brought against Robert Smith, the Mormon slaveholder who kept Biddy Mason and her family captive until she was rescued by free Black people in Southern California. It's a story that allows me to talk about the role that free Black people played in this resistance. In addition to slavery, in 1850, California's first legislature passed a law prohibiting court testimony by Black people and Native people. Years later, the law was extended to Chinese people. And the law had dire consequences for Black people. You're looking here at a new clipping from the Sacramento Daily Union on November 1st, 1861. Which reproduces the testimony given by Samuel Meredith in a notorious murder trial. In 1861, George Gordon was an African-American man who owned a barber shop and his barber shop contained his sister-in-law's millinery shop in the basement of a very swanky hotel in the Niantic building in San Francisco. Gordon was very well-known citizen. He was politically active. And in this case, he was shot and then beaten to death by a white man named Robert Shell. The only eyewitness to the crime was an African-American man, Samuel Meredith, mentioned in this clipping, and whose testimony was disqualified by the judge because of this exclusionary law. And so as a consequence, Shell was convicted because white people were able to testify to ancillary facts, but he only served 2 years for the crime. This is an image of a petition that was circulated and is in the collection of the California Historical Society. For 12 years, African Americans conducted a petition campaign against these court testimony exclusion laws. And every year, the legislature, which was dominated during this time by pro-slavery, pro-South members, responded by throwing the petitions out the window. And that is what literally happened. It's in the record. And there were other sessions of the legislature where the petitions were thrown into the waste bin. The law was finally changed in 1863 during the height of the Civil War, when the Lincoln Republicans were the majority in the California legislature, and they worked with Black constituents. Another instance of the civic influence of African Americans that I discuss in the book is the pivotal role that Black politics played during the women's suffrage campaigns in California. And we're looking here on the left at, we're looking at photographs of a few of the state's leading suffragist African-American women who have been completely left out of the story. And of course, the book is going to be restoring these, this part of history. On the left is Naomi Anderson. She was born in Indiana, but she came to live in San Francisco and was a famous orator during the 1896 campaign to establish women's suffrage in California. In the middle is Sarah Massey Overton, who ran a catering business in San Jose with her husband, Jacob Overton. And she was vice president of San Jose's Interracial Suffrage Amendment League, one of the few interracial organizations of its kind. And on the right is Charlotta Bass, publisher of the Los Angeles-based California Eagle newspaper, and she was one of the voices that helped convince the California legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1919. This is an image of a meeting of the California State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. It was taken in their meeting in Oakland in 1915, but the organization was established in the state in 1906 as part of a national federation of colored women. Black women organized their own clubs because they wanted to associate with those of similar culture and life experience, and because the majority of white women's suffrage organizations excluded Black membership as a matter of policy and practice. This was a form of segregation that white women in the suffrage movement were not willing to give up. Now remember that the objective of the women's suffrage campaigns was to convince the majority of male voters to cast their ballots on behalf of the cause. And since 1870, and the Reconstruction Amendments and the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote after the Civil War, Black men and women had built what you could call an alliance on the view that Black male suffrage and votes for women were rights to be gained in sequence. At the same time that this alliance between Black men and Black women was built, white suffragists were rampaging against the 15th Amendment. And leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and many others expressed themselves in an unfortunate way that betrayed the racism of these former abolitionists. But the alliance between Black men and Black women paid off because Black men's support for women's suffrage was nearly universal in the United States and in California. Now, what you're looking at here is an image of Jefferson Lewis Edmonds of Los Angeles and his newspaper, The Liberator, which expressed Edmonds' outspoken support for women obtaining the vote. And here's an image of Theophilus Morton, who was the president for many years of the Afro-American League, which was a kind of interim organization before the formation, civil rights organization before the formation of the NAACP. During her 1896 statewide stump on behalf of women's suffrage, Mrs. Naomi Anderson, whose picture we saw earlier and who was a dear friend with Theophilus Morton, declared in one of her well-received speeches that the colored men know what it is to be deprived of the ballot, and I am sure they will do what they can to release white and colored women from the same humiliating state of silent slavery. She said that in a speech in Oakland, and Theophilus Morton, who sponsored many of Naomi Anderson's pro-women's suffrage appearances, every year pledged the membership, the Black male membership of the Afro-American League to vote for women's suffrage. This is very important to know, and it deserves more examination, because in 1911, when women's suffrage was passed, the amendment was passed, and women in California had the vote, the margin of victory was razor thin, and it approximates, it was about 3,000 votes, and it approximates the number of Black male votes in California. Innovation, another contribution to civic transformation in California was the innovation of political coalitions and electoral politics. And this coalition building has had consequences right up through our times. Without it, in 1973, Tom Bradley never would have been elected mayor of a large city by a mostly white Los Angeles. Ron Oden would never have become the first gay African-American mayor of Palm Springs in 2003. African-Americans began running for office in California starting in the 19th century. And one of the things that's remarkable about this is because it was at a time post-Reconstruction when the South was destroying Black political participation. There were people like Dennis Carter in Nevada City who ran for town marshal. His wife, Jenny Carter, was a very interesting figure. She was a columnist for the Black-owned Pacific Appeal newspaper. Isaac Sanks ran for constable in Grass Valley as a candidate for the Republican Party in the same year. And Edward Duplex, who owned a popular barbershop patronized by whites and was active in the Convention of Colored Citizens of California, was elected as mayor of Wheatland in Yuba County in 1888. Sidney Jones is an example of an early 20th century political figure. He was a developer who almost single-handedly created Central Avenue in Los Angeles and developed Valverde, a Black resort near Valencia, known as the Black Palm Springs. He first ran for city council in 1915. And Charles Wilson ran in 1914 as the first Black candidate for the state assembly, but it was Frederick Roberts, who we see here, who became in 1919 the first African-American elected to the state assembly. He had operated the New Age newspaper in Los Angeles. His family owned the A.J. Roberts and Son Mortuary Company. And on his mother's side, he was descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Heming. Now, to close out my presentation, I want to mention some of the threads I'm weaving throughout the book related to the utopian imagination of African Americans in California and their ability to dream of new life. This is an image of the Lundy family at the Costin Ostrich farm in South Pasadena in 1937. And this was during a time when ostrich farms were like the amusement parks of the day, especially for Southern Californians. I'll be mentioning the Hire sisters, Anna Mata Hires and Emma Louise Hires. They were born in Sacramento in the mid-19th century, where they made their musical debut at the Metropolitan Theater. They were opera singers, and they became internationally known for their extraordinary singing voices and for producing the first full-fledged musicals in which African Americans had dignified roles without minstrelsy. Then there's examples such as then Captain Charles Young, who became the first African American superintendent of a national park when he commanded the all-Black 9th Cavalry Buffalo Soldier troops in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park in 1903. And I've read the reports that are in the archive that he wrote to the Interior Department on the need to conserve the giant trees in the park, and they are eloquent and impassioned. The people in the surrounding Tulare County were so grateful for the job that he and the troops and some of the residents had done in building roads and patrolling the park that they wanted to honor him by naming a tree for him. But he demurred, and the tree was named at his request for Booker T. Washington, president of Tuskegee Institute. And there's a picture of the Booker T. Washington tree, which you can visit today in Sequoia National Park. Another example of this utopian imagination is the establishment of Allensworth by actually another Buffalo soldier, Lieutenant Colonel and Army Chaplain Allen Allensworth, who led a group of Los Angeles citizens to found the all-Black independent town as an experiment in self-government with its own voting district, school, and the first branch in the middle picture of the Tulare County Library. The library was built on land donated by Josephine Allensworth, the colonel's wife, and the role of women, the role that women played in the life of Allensworth was very significant. This farming community it has been preserved as Colonel Allensworth State Historic Park. Now, California was and remains a center of the aviation and aeronautics industry, and African Americans were among early enthusiasts of flight. What you see on the left is a picture in Los Angeles of the billboard for the popular Colored Air Circus and its 5 blackbirds, as its pilots were called. And on the right is a portrait of Bessie Coleman, the aviatrix who flew exhibition and commercial flights in Oakland a decade before Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly to Oakland from Hawaii in 1935. And of course, Southern California is a locus for beach and resort culture for African Americans, despite the harassment and segregation they faced by white beachgoers and municipal governments. On the left is an image of the Black-owned resort in Manhattan Beach, Bruce's Beach. In the middle, a portrait of Arthur Reese, who was a colleague of Abbot Kinney, who created the canals in the community of Venice. Arthur Reese was known as the Wizard of Venice because of the floats and other decorations he built for events on the canals. And on the right is a couple whose name I'm forgetting at segregated Santa Monica Beach, but they got married. According to the scholar of this area, Alice and Rose Jefferson, they got married not long after this picture was taken. And of course, there are companies like Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company that sold financial services to Black customers when white companies refused. These companies had massive civil impact as employers, helping to create a Black middle class. And they were one of the sources for financing the civil rights movement. California is the center of the production of soul. It's an aspect of history that I will be considering in the book. Soul, the mixture and mingling of arts and Black power. With the establishment of Soul magazine by Ken and Regina Jones in 1966 in response to the Watts riots, Soul Train moved from its Chicago home to Los Angeles in 1971. You know, people think Motown is in Detroit, but Motown, the Gordy family, and just about all of the artists on their roster relocated to Los Angeles in 1972. And also California is the site of the origination of the Blaxploitation genre in Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song in 1971. So on the left, what you see is a rack of Soul magazine covers, and on the right, Pam Grier at the Watts Towers as one of her film characters, Foxy Brown. I'm researching for the book the post-World War II civil rights movement in California. It was provided the roots of the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. I've been able to talk with some of those leaders of that movement, Mike Miller, Bettina Aptheker, and others, and to tell the story of those students and their participation in marches like this one in San Francisco Civic Center in 1961, which the newspapers called the Big Colored Parade. Students who participated in the civil rights movement, and particularly in the Bay Area or the Southern movement, like Mario Savio and his participation in Mississippi Freedom Summer in '63, and how that led to their participation in the free speech movement. California was a major support also for the Southern movement. And the state is the home of the Black Power movement. On the left, a young GI in the war against Vietnam. His sign says Oakland, 11,000 miles from Vietnam. In the middle, a poster, a Black Panther Party poster that says all power to the people. And on the right, Black Lives Matter painted in the street of Martinez, California in Contra Costa County last year during the Black Lives Matter protests. So to conclude, I want to say that the field of history is a battle over who has power over the narrative. And I feel that with my book, I'm striking a blow to restore the presence of African Americans to the California story and to reframe the story and reinterpret it. And I think everybody benefits from that, because quoting J.L. Edmonds, the publisher of the Los Angeles Liberator newspaper, if we erased from the pages of American history the Negro's presence, it would be a short uninteresting story. Thank you.
That is outstanding. And I hope everybody will join me in applauding the effort of Susan Anderson. This is just so remarkable, the work that you have been able to put together for this presentation alone, but for the larger project, I am so excited to see what you have coming forth. This is a really, really big deal. So let me begin by just sharing my congratulations on how wide-ranging this research is. To me, I think it's fascinating that you are able to stretch the state, that is from the top of the state to the bottom of the state, and everywhere in between, you've been able to pick up various nuggets and historical pieces that we haven't been able to learn about in our books and in the curriculum. So I think this is one thing that you should be congratulated on. I think another thing, though, that we should probably speak to is your approach to the history. One of the things that I wrote down that you said as you were closing is that you wanted to have, in some ways, power over the narrative. One of the things that happens when people discuss or address African-American history, and particularly African-American history in California, is we always speak of Black people as though they're downtrodden and as though there's something missing or wrong with Black people. I noticed in your presentation, maybe you're taking a different approach to Black people and their role in California. So I'm interested in, is this intentional? What's the approach that you're taking with regard to the agency of the Black people who were able to make a living and make a life, better yet, here in California?
Thank you so much, Professor Bradley. Thank you, Stefan. I'm sure it is intentional. I think that I didn't become aware of the intentionality until I was kind of deep into the work. Let me say, I mean, this partly comes out of my personal experience as a fourth generation Californian, whose great grandparents on my mother's side, both sets of my great grandparents and their families came as young people to California in the 1880s. And, you know, I grew up just like everybody else. It's still this truism that you hear that, well, there's very few Black people in California, as if that's a way of explaining away, you know, the way that their history has been diminished. And they didn't really start showing up until World War II, the Great Migration in World War II to work in the defense industry. And I knew better than that. You know, my grandfather's mother and father and aunts and uncles established a church in West Oakland, actually, that still is there. And you know, I'd been watching these elders in my own family create institutions and traditions. So I knew that the way the story was being told was inaccurate. I think what you're saying too about, I knew that we as a people had resources, and that because I'd seen them in my own experience. And then as I began studying, that we had deployed these resources in the culture and in civic life and in a religious life. And so, yeah, far from this sort of deficit-ridden view that racism creates of Black people, I was aware that we were resourced, we were rich with resources, that we were innovating. And you know, several historians have talked about, the ones that have paid attention to this population, that have talked about since the 19th century, that the Black people that came west had this initiative, had more initiative than anybody, because of what they had to. It was hard enough to come west in the 19th century for anybody, but given what they faced, you know, the historian said that they had more drive and initiative. They were usually had higher literacy rates among the men and the women. And so I think that we inherited all of those things. And if we see California, as I'm saying, as an advanced kind of place, then we've got to ask ourselves, how did that happen? Because the state certainly doesn't have its origins in that kind of culture.
Yeah, that's and such a wonderful response as well. I deeply appreciate the idea of tossing out this deficit model of approaching Black life. Here, these were hard charging people who embodied whatever the best of America is. They embodied that by making their way out to California at a time when it was dangerous for a number of different reasons, including the racism that that you spoke to. And so one of the things that I wanted to see if you could speak to a little further is this. I think people will always be a little bit shocked to find out about slavery being in the West. But could you talk to us a little bit more about this anti-slavery movement that occurred out here in California? It always made me think twice about things because we think of California as being the most liberal spaces, and you know, when we think about the Compromise of 1850 and all that kind of thing, it gives us a sense. But if you could speak to that, I'd be very interested.
Well, California was born out of the politics of slavery. When the state was admitted to the United States in 1850, it was part of another dire compromise that resulted in California's constitution being upheld, that said it would not tolerate slavery. But it also resulted in the most draconian fugitive slave law that had ever been passed in the country's history. And you know, the Congress trying to strike this phony balance between the slaveholders' interests and people who did not want to see the expansion of slavery. So the nature of California is that it's born out of the politics of slavery. And there were many people, and this is not my area, but there are more scholars who are starting to look now at the pro-slavery, slave-owning, pro-Southern population that came to California, hoping to make at least a portion of it a slaveocracy. And that lasted for decades until after the Civil War. And so in California, the economy, you know, unlike the South or the Northeast for that matter, these, you know, they were intricately bound in a slave economy. California's economy didn't rest upon slavery, but it was what Ira Berlin called a slave society, one that practiced slavery alongside other types of labor. And I'm definitely, you know, right about that. But you're right. My emphasis, because I'm trying to have the book be a vehicle for the Black voices. I'm not telling the slavers' story. I'm trying to tell the story of the Black people who were here and who were connected to their folks around the country in the anti-slavery movement. And, you know, we're seeing more and more in the scholarship, people are starting to understand what Du Bois was writing about generations ago, that the leadership of the, we all grew up with this sort of picture of, when you say abolitionist, you're thinking of some nice white Quaker people. And it's really, a disservice to have the abolitionist movement mischaracterized, because what I write about in the book is, in California and nationally, the leadership of the movement is African American. And the leading white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison were the first to say that during their lifetime. They knew they were followers. So in California, I get to tell stories. I have a chapter on slavery and the resistance to slavery. And I get to tell stories from around the state, because slavery was practiced in every portion of the state, in cities, in rural areas, in homesteading areas, in the mines. I get to tell the story about the different forms of that the resistance took, and the way the leadership manifested itself, and the way the campaigns, the raising of money, the using of personal wealth by people like George Washington Dennis, who was a wealthy Black San Franciscan, Mary Ellen Pleasant, a wealthy San Franciscan Black woman who used their own wealth. There were definitely wealthy Black people in California. In fact, quite a few historians like Quintard Taylor and others have said that they were the wealthiest Black people in the country. But think about it, because of the imposition of slavery and racism, their wealth had to be diverted into their freedom struggles.
Absolutely.
Every wealthy Black person in California knew that they were going to have to spend money to hire white lawyers to take the case of somebody who ran from their captor, or to put somebody up, or to buy a wagon to hide people, to drive them to the harbor so they could be put on a ship.
Wow.
So that I discovered, I was able to go in depth. I just came back not that long ago, for instance, from a trip to Tuolumne County, which is where Yosemite National Park is located, and is the scene of a lot of events at this time in the history. But there's this case, the case of Stephen Hill, who had a ranch and wealth, and it was all taken from him because someone stole his manumission papers. So the precarity of freedom,
yes.
for even free Black people in California was an issue.
Outstanding. Power over the narrative. That's what I keep coming back to, that you had mentioned. And so some things that stood out in your response, and we're going to turn this over to some audience questions, but I just have to mention this long activist history, this long struggle for freedom, where Black people use their own wealth, use their own, energy and efforts to help other Black people, from Carlotta Bass to these various Black Power organizations that you were talking about, to the students at San Francisco State College. All of these various people had this long history dating back to what 19th century here in California. So thank you so much for revealing all of this, for revisiting all of this. It's super important for us. And so one of the things that we're going to do right now is turn over to some audience questions. There was a really good question about somebody who had read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns. And the person wanted to know about the Great Migration and how that might have shifted California's leanings, whether it became more liberal because of this great migration out to the West and to California in particular. What do you think about that?
I take issue with the phrase the Great Migration. Because first, we're talking about such a long span of history. And it is true to describe people leaving the South, it makes sense because that's what was happening. Because the South was so backward, because white supremacy was so vicious in the South, and we still see that going on, people were leaving in droves, and that started after the Civil War, frankly. The exodus of Black people out of the South was so dramatic after the Civil War, with Pap Singleton and all of those people leading people into Kansas and Oklahoma and establishing Black towns. The United States Senate in the 1870s held hearings to find out why Black people were leaving. It was, really a period of almost a century of people leaving the South. Now, as a Californian, one of the things that happens, and I'm in the book trying to reconceptualize these things, is we keep talking about migrants coming to California over, and like I said, over 100-year period of time. Now, my question is, when have we arrived? When are we actually here in California and can start telling our story with our feet on the soil of California looking out, instead of being seen as migrants? When you talk of, Black people weren't the only people rushing into California over that century. As you know, California had multiple population booms, and everybody was coming into this state at one time or another. Nobody else is considered, their history is not considered a migrant history. Once you're here, you're here. So I actually I respect that book, and especially the Little California segment, but I take issue with this framework because at some point we've got to start speaking as Westerners and saying, there's another leg to this story. And we, of course, have our on the side of our Black ancestors, because many of us have other kinds of ancestors who aren't Black, but on the side of our Black ancestors, yes, we're talking about Southern roots. But if your Southern roots are 100 years back, why are we still talking about migration? When are we going to be full-fledged Westerners or full-fledged Californians?
Such an excellent point. Such an excellent point. I think in the historical profession, I think for the longest time, so we're talking about this kind of regionalism, for the longest time, they talked about Southerners. And when anybody mentioned Southerners, they meant white people. Well, obviously, Black people have been there as long as anybody else. And by you stretching the boundaries of whatever anybody conceives of as a great migration, what you're saying is Black people are Westerners, and embrace that and fill that out. That's wonderful. Scripps College is, I didn't know you all went this hard out here. Another wonderful question they have here. You spoke a lot about what appear to be middle-class figures from the early 20th century. Could you add maybe some class nuance to some of the other figures? For example, do we find resistance from the domestic workers or the shoeshine workers in that earlier period? And I'd be curious, later on, you mentioned the Panthers and maybe the US organization, but I think there's some class nuance that you in the larger project are speaking to. So maybe you can talk a little bit more to that.
Yes. Well, you're presuming, the question is presuming middle class. I never said anything about the class of the people. I did mention wealthy people, pulling out a few names. But in a, in a society that uses, race to classify people, here's one of the difficulties of dealing with that. Using traditional class analysis about the African American people in the United States is not going to work to understand what's going on with them and how they intervene and interact with US society. And here's what I mean. So whether it's in the 19th century or in the 21st century, you might have someone who is a porter on a railroad, or you might have someone who's a clerk in a court, or a janitor for a municipality. And these are all people that I write about in the book who played a role in the freedom struggle. And in the overall society, in white society, it may look like they're a lowly person, that they have, a humble occupation. But if you look more deeply, you might find out that they are the publisher of the weekly Black newspaper in the Bay Area, or they're the treasurer of their 150-year-old church, or they are a highly placed person in the Masons and responsible for a dozen charities in their community. So, this is a discussion that it takes, it definitely takes nuance, because we cannot apply, I don't think, the same categories and classifications when we talk about Black society and people who have humble occupations. When you hear that they are civil rights leaders, you might be assuming that they're middle class, but I never said they were middle class. And most of them have humble occupations because they've been forced to by the racial divisions in US society.
Yeah, and I think this is classic in many ways. The idea of a Black middle class isn't parallel with what the nation considers middle class, and so the working class occupations of Black people oftentimes led to middle class status in Black communities, and so this is always a nuanced conversation. Thank you for that. There were several questions, good questions about religion. There were good questions about the interaction between Black and Indigenous people. But this will be the final question that we deal with, and I think it's a very prescient question at this time. The person was interested, appreciated that you mentioned Charles Young at Sequoia National Park, but wanted to know if there were women who were involved in the conservation and natural resources agricultural and horticultural movement throughout the history of California, and what did that look like?
Yes, it's a great question. I just finished working with a team of people to create an exhibition that is finished, but because of COVID was not able to travel to museums, but now that museums are starting to open, is going to be traveling. And we at CAM are creating a digital version, and there's a podcast series that I can make sure Karina has in case anybody's interested. And it's based on my research. Actually, it was all research for the book. It's called We Are Not Strangers Here: African Americans in Rural California, African American Histories in Rural California. And it tells the story about farmers, ranchers, homesteaders, women who created garden clubs and created vernacular gardens, who contributed to agricultural life, and people, so starting from the 19th century through now, and the urban farm movement, which is primarily in California led by women in Oakland and, other places. And we interviewed them and talked with them for this series. So, and the history we're talking about within the museum, perhaps partnering with some places that I'm not able to say right now, and doing some micro exhibits and programs on African Americans and the views of the natural world, because the roots of Black people in the land are deep. And it's a conversation that we want to open up for a lot of reasons, but it is one that we kept a clamp on for a long time, partly because of the history of the exploitation of our labor and the enslavement of our labor on the land. But I think people are ready to open up about this and have broader discussions. So yes, there are thousands of examples in the exhibit and in the podcast. We use that wonderful essay that Alice Walker wrote a long time ago, In Search of My Mother's Garden. And there's that just moving section where she talks about, her mother was kind of a muted person, maybe oppressed, but the way her mother came alive in her garden and the way her garden was her kingdom. I have a dear friend who was the first archivist in the Duke Ellington archive for 20 years. And he does a wonderful talk that we want to do as part of what we're talking about at CAM on Duke Ellington's, suites and symphonies related to the natural world. And they're just some astonishing work. So, and from that to George Washington Carver, who saw, the land and the cultivation of the land as a social justice issue. This is completely intertwined with the history of our people in this country, and it's something that we definitely brought from the motherland, brought from Africa with us.
Absolutely. And this speaks volumes about the expansiveness of your work. My goodness. And so people say that this has much to do with Scripps College and your relationship to Scripps College, but I don't know where it comes from, but it's a blessing to us. So please, everybody, a round of applause for Susan Anderson. And thank you so much for sharing this tidbit. I'm so excited about this. By the way, everybody go out and become a history major. And we can win this way. So thank you very much for your work, Susan Anderson. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you, Stefan.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to both of you. This was so wonderful. I know how honored I feel, and I speak for our whole audience, for getting a preview of all of this work. It feels like part one to me. We'll hope to have you back to hear more as the project develops. So thanks everybody for being here.